صبح بصوتك اسمع الأكوان اقرأ كلام الله داوي نفوسنا لنحس في أعماقنا الإيمان كالحجارة قسوة فإذا القرآن حين
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهد الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا صلى الله عليه وسلم عبده ورسوله. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to our series, Reflections on the Qur'an. In our previous episode, we talked about some of the Qur'an's rational arguments. I'd like to wrap that up and then talk about a really interesting article that's related to this topic, written by Professor Mustansir Mir on the Qur'an's presentation of certain flawed arguments, indicating that these are flawed arguments. And so this goes back again to the whole proposition that the Qur'an doesn't simply appeal to people's emotions. It really is calling upon people to use their minds, and one aspect of the mind is the capacity to reason. So some of the leftover points from our previous episode, ways that the Qur'an presents arguments. One is to accept the opponent's point of view or position for the sake of argument in order to eventually show them there's something wrong, that the implications of that position are untenable. And one of the classic examples of that is in the story of Ibrahim with regard to his sighting of the star and then the moon and then the sun, and his discussion with his people. So when he sees that star, he says, هذا ربي فلما أفل قال لا أحب الآفلين. He sees the star and he says, this is my Lord. And then when it sets, he says, I have no love for that which sets, meaning that which is inconstant. So that which is subject to change cannot be divine. And so then he sees the moon. Now, from the overall context of this passage, he's not there in private, doing these things in private. He's doing it in front of his people, as we'll point out when we get to the end of this passage. So the second stage is that he looks at the moon after it's risen, and he says, this is my Lord. And then the moon sets, and he says, if my Lord does not guide me, I will be surely astray. And then the sun rises. One can imagine that this whole thing is going on in a day and a night, or a night and a day. So the sun rises, and he says, this is my Lord, this is bigger. So it's bigger, more powerful. So, that was the kind of logic that his people used, because in the ancient world, what was the supreme deity? It was usually the sun god. And the sun also sets. And what happens then? Ibrahim tells his people, I absolve myself and have nothing to do with what it is that you are worshiping along with Allah. I have turned my face, meaning my being, towards the creator of the heavens and the earth. And then it says that his people began to dispute with him. They argued with him. And he says, are you disputing with me concerning Allah when He's guided me? I fear not at all what you set up beside Him, unless my Lord wills anything. Now, in the context of that kind of a society, if you say, I don't believe in those gods that you're worshiping, I mean, that's blasphemy. And what's the reaction? you're going to get struck dead by these gods because you're blaspheming against these gods. And so he's saying, I have nothing to fear. The only one who will harm me is Allah, if Allah chooses to. These other deities don't exist. They can't benefit or harm. And so then he counter-argues with them. He said, I have nothing to be afraid of. It's you who have something to be afraid of because you have made up something to worship instead of Allah, and He gave you no authority to do so. And then at the very end of this passage, we'll compress it for the sake of time, Allah says, تِلْكَ حُجَّتُنَا آتَيْنَاهَا إِبْرَاهِيمَ عَلَى قَوْمِهِ. That was our proof, that was our argument that we gave to Ibrahim to use against his people. So those who said that Ibrahim was a searcher of truth and he didn't know quite what to worship and he was sort of feeling his way to the truth, and that's what this passage is talking about, doesn't really make sense, because the entire process was something that Allah provided Ibrahim in order to argue against his people and their worship of these other deities. And so to bring it back to our original point, what Ibrahim was doing was accepting the position of the other side, his people, in order to show the inconsistencies and the weakness of that position as events unfolded, to highlight the weaknesses of that position that they'd taken. Another example of that, which is the basis for the Muslim theologians, what they call dalil al-tamanu', is the passage in Surah Al-Anbiya, وَلَوْ كَانَ فِيهِمَا آلِهَةٌ إِلَّا اللَّهُ لَفَسَدَتَا. If there were gods other than Allah in both the heavens and the earth, both would have become corrupted. And so the way that dalil al-tamanu' was put forward by Muslim theologians based upon this verse was that if there really were more than one deity that has a say in the way the universe runs, then each deity would have a will and they would make decisions about what should happen. And because they're independent, they're not the same being, then the nature of that situation is that at some point they're going to disagree. So let's say one of them says that Fulan, so-and-so, today he's going to die at 3:47 p.m. And the other one says, no, he's not, he's going to stay alive. So what are the logical possibilities from this disagreement? Well, both of them could have their way. Conceivably, well, it doesn't really make sense, because then this guy would be alive and dead at the same time, and you have to be one or the other. The other possibility is that their wills cancel out, in which case that person is neither alive nor dead, and that's also patently ridiculous. So the only viable possibility is that one of them, his will overrides the other. And if he says that that person is going to be alive, then they'll be alive. If he says that person will die, that person will die. In that case, what about the will of this other so-called deity? It means that if he can't impose his will, then he's not the deity. He has no right to be worshipped. And so they derived that argument from that verse. The reference that I made earlier to Professor Mustansir Mir, he pointed out that there are certain places in the Qur'an where the Qur'an calls attention to false argument, fallacious argument, things that have no place in a rational discourse. And he has these fancy Latin names for these categories. I've never studied logic formally, so they didn't mean anything to me, and they probably won't mean anything to you, so let's not talk about those Latin names. So the first category that he identifies is argument by the stick. That's the literal translation of the Latin name. In other words, the threat of violence. And in the discourse that went on in Surah Hud between Shu'aib and his people said, Shu'aib, we don't understand much of what you say. We see that you're weak, and had it not been for your tribe, we would have stoned you, for you're not too difficult for us to handle. So, there's this threat. We're not going to kill you, but if we really wanted to, we could. And instead of responding to any of his arguments, they resort to a threat of force. And Fir'aun, who's the ultimate kafir, in Surah Al-Shu'ara, which is a really interesting surah from this angle because there's a lengthy discussion between Musa and Fir'aun. We'll talk about that discussion after the break, inshallah.
Dialogue. Discussion. Debate. Rebuttal. Conclusion.
Eliminate misconceptions about religion. Get enlightened.
Witness Dr. Zakir Naik in a battle of words in Crossfire. Tomorrow at 8:30 p.m. and repeat telecast at 12:30 p.m. UK on Peace TV.
Welcome back. We're talking about the debate between Fir'aun and Musa in Surah Al-Shu'ara. So during the course of that debate, which has many little points that are relevant to the whole issue of how arguments should be constructed or what are valid or invalid ways to argue, at one point, Fir'aun says, قال لئن اتخذت إلها غيري لأجعلنك من المسجونين. And basically what he's telling Moses is, you know, if you worship anyone except me, I'm going to throw you in jail. And so again, the threat of force. With Ibrahim, we all know that it wasn't just a threat. His people said, قالوا حرقوه وانصروا آلهتكم إن كنتم فاعلين. Burn him up and come to the aid of your deities if you wish to do something. And this passage in Surah Al-Anbiya, it comes at the end of an actual discussion in which Ibrahim routed his people. You know, they found that these idols had been broken up, and then they said, who did this? You know, he must be a real evildoer. And somebody said, we heard this young guy, Ibrahim, he was saying something about the idols that was disrespectful. So then they say, bring him in front of everybody, so that everybody witnesses what happens to him. And so then they confront him. He said, did you do this to our gods? And he says, it was the big one. So ask them if they can speak. So, you know, they are kind of abashed by that. The ones who are conducting the interrogation, they turn to each other and they say, whoops. They said, he put us in a tight spot, basically. They said, إِنَّكُمْ أَنْتُمُ الظَّالِمُونَ. It's you who are the wrongdoers here. And then they turn back to Ibrahim. They say, well, you know that these guys can't talk. And Ibrahim says, why are you worshiping that which has no power to benefit you or harm you? أُفِّ لَكُمْ وَمَا تَعْبُدُونَ مِن دُونِ اللَّهِ. At that point, he actually kind of challenges them. And this kind of uff is a dismissive statement. Uff to you and whatever it is that you worship instead of Allah. أَفَلَا تَعْقِلُونَ. Won't you use your intellects? And at that point, you know, they're seeing red. They hit the panic button, which is, he's outraged us. He already defeated us when it came to rational argument. The only thing left is to kill him. So they cast him into the fire, and of course, Allah protected him. You know, a classic example is that exchange between Ibrahim and the king, who is debating with him about the nature of divinity. And Ibrahim says, Rabbi alladhi yuhyi wa yumit. My Lord is the one who gives life and death. So the king said, Ana uhyi wa umit. I give life and I give death. Bring 2 prisoners from the jail. You're free to go. I gave him life. You, execute him on the spot. I gave him death. So then Ibrahim says, well, Allah brings the sun from the east, so if you're divine, bring it from the west. So he stumped him. So all of that is an indication of rational argument that could not be confronted rationally, so it was then the other side resorted to force. Another kind of a fallacious argument, this is kind of entered into English, what's called an ad hominem argument, which means that instead of addressing the argument, you start attacking the person. You know, this guy, he's not a good man, he did this or that. And so by calling attention to the person who's making the argument and his personality, you then take people's attention away from the argument that he's actually making. And the nobles of the people of Nuh alayhi salam, they kind of used this argument. فقال الملأ الذين كفروا من قومه ما نراك إلا بشرا مثلنا وما نراك اتبعك إلا الذين هم أراذلنا بادي الرأي وما نرى لكم علينا من فضل بل نظنكم كاذبين. We see that you're just a human being like us. We see that only those people have followed you who are quite obviously the lowliest among us. And we see that you're in no way superior to us. In fact, we suspect that you're liars. So the Quraysh made a similar argument, which is that the only people who are following you are the lower class, slaves and people like that. And these young people, the respected people of the society aren't following you, and therefore there's something wrong with your message, because the real people who deserve respect don't believe your message. So that's a kind of indirect attack on the argument. In that example, it's an attack on the argument based upon those who have accepted it, rather more directly than the person who's making it. Another kind of example of that is the courtiers of Fir'aun, when they're talking about Musa and Harun, قالوا نؤمن لبشرين مثلنا وقومهما لنا عابدون. Are we going to believe in two men who are like us when their people are our slaves? How can the truth possibly come from those people? They're slaves. We're on top, and so we must be right. And Fir'aun, in another place, he said, أم أنا خير من هذا الذي هو مهين ولا يكاد يبين. It's well known that Musa alayhi salam had like a speech impediment. He stuttered, he couldn't speak very fluently. That's why he asked that Harun also be made a prophet so that he could help him convey the message. So Fir'aun seized upon that in one incident where he's telling his people, this guy, he can't yubin, la yakad yubin. He can hardly make out what he's saying. So whatever he's saying must be wrong. So these are kind of arguments directed at the person presenting the argument rather than the substance of the argument. Another kind of argument is playing to the crowd and their prejudices. So again, in Surah Ash-Shu'ara, Fir'aun, he turns to the courtiers around him and he says, this one here, talking about Musa, after he's thrown down that stick and it turned into a snake, and he brought his hand out from under his armpit, and it's shining, giving off light. Fir'aun says to the courtiers, this one here is a sophisticated magician. He intends to expel you from your land by means of his magic. So this guy is threatening our personal interests, your personal interests, and therefore beware of him. Don't listen to him. So he's appealing to the prejudices and the emotions of the crowd. And in another passage, the courtiers are saying, indeed, these are two wizards who would drive you out from your country by their magic, which is reproducing that same argument that Fir'aun had mentioned. And what else is he going to do? He will destroy your exemplary way of life. So, again, it's an appeal to this social group, the American way of life. In India, everybody has their customs and their way of life, and our way of life is the best. So if anybody wants to come and say that what we're doing is not the best possible, he is threatening our way of life. So these are all arguments to the crowd, to sway the crowd based upon their prejudices and their emotions. Another is to kind of put somebody into a tight spot where any answer they give would be put them in some kind of difficult position where if they say one thing, it means that they accept a premise of the opponent. Or if they say another thing, then the people who are listening will be offended. So an example of that is Fir'aun, when he's discussing, Musa has come to him and he's presenting this message, and he says, did we not bring you up when you were a child? And did you not stay with us for many years of your life? So if he says yes, then it's like, you're indebted to us. We took care of you. You should acknowledge your place in the social order and not rock the boat. If you acknowledge it, then you should shut up. And if you deny it, then everybody around will know that you're an ingrate. So, that's the classic example of that is in a courtroom where the cross-examination is going on and the lawyer says, Mr. Jones, are you still beating your wife? So if he says yes, and he says, just tell me yes or no. So if he says yes, it means he's still beating his wife. And if he says no, it means that he's accepting the premise that he used to beat his wife, but now he's stopped. So phrasing an argument in a context that would put the person into difficulty if he responds in the terms that you've given him, that's also a kind of a underhanded way to argue. We've run out of time for this episode. Thank you for your viewing. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Wallahu a'lam.
اقرأ أخيا ورتل القرآن